Professor Graham Priest, how are you?
Good morning. Well, good evening. I'm delighted to be with you.
Okay. And yeah, Aqil, how are you?
I'm fine, but I'm a little bit busy right now. There's a lot of things happened back then. So yeah.
Okay. I assume you're quite nervous because you are one panel with Professor Graham Priest now.
Of course, of course.
Professor told us to call him Graham. So, can you tell me a little bit about yourself, Graham?
Sure. I grew up in London in the UK, and that's where I completed my education. So I studied at Cambridge University and the London School of Economics. But my training was as a mathematician. By the time I finished my doctorate in mathematics, I knew that philosophy was a lot more fun than mathematics. Okay. And so I wanted to be a philosopher, and I was offered a job in the philosophy department, so I took it. That was a temporary job at the University of St Andrews. The first permanent job I was offered was in Australia. So I had a young family at the time. We moved to Australia, and we didn't think we were emigrating, but we were, because we expected to go back and we never did. And so since then, I've worked at in 3 universities in Australia until I was off the job here in New York about a dozen years ago, and since then I've lived in New York. As you might expect, my background, my early work was mainly in logic, mathematical logic, but my interests have spread all over the place in the last 50 years, and now there are very few parts of philosophy that don't interest me. So I've written on metaphysics, I've written on the history of philosophy, and also I've been engaged with not just Western philosophy, but Eastern philosophy. So I've written quite a lot on, especially Buddhism. That's the Eastern tradition I know most about. But I've also written on political philosophy, on epistemology. So, as I say, I mean, most areas of philosophy interest me. And in the end, they're all connected, they're all linked up. You've got to be around for a while to see some of the connections, though. Okay, that's about me.
Okay. This podcast episode is quite different because for the first time, my channel has a not co-host, a co-host, which is Aqil from Intuitionistik ID. Did I say the name right, Aqil? It's Intuitionistik ID, right? I cannot quite hear you, Aqil.
Yeah, that's right. Intuitionistic ID.
Okay, great. So Intuisionistik ID is one of philosophy collective in Indonesia where they focus on discussing and communicating ideas about logics to the masses. I think this is a very new movement, if I'm not mistaken, in Indonesia, and I think it will be very beneficial for us Indonesians to learn more about logic, how they operate, and who can we turn into if you want to learn more about logics? Is there anything you'd like to ask to add from what I say, Aqil?
Yeah, we got inspiration from Brouwer. Like that's mathematician from Dutch. That's mathematician. He came with idea that uh mathematics it grounded from intuition, and it opposite from the formalism that say that, and logicism, I guess, and said that like mathematics grounded in logic. But in intuitionism itself, logic is grounded in mathematics. But we don't take that much. We just want to say that, yeah, we grounded on proof, and what we want to say anything about it, what we want to say about philosophy and anything about it, we need to prove it. Like, yeah, our just proof, like, BHK interpretation, like that. And yeah, this is gonna be, I don't know. I'm a little bit anxious right now because they're calm right now. And
Okay, just relax. Just
yeah,
relax. You're fine.
uh, we take inspiration from like uh logician lake from Australia, I guess. That, yeah, we want to collect or make a community that interest on logics in Indonesia, because this field is literally new in here. Here it's literally new, and we know just that classical logic. Even Indonesia said that propositional logic and syllogism is the same thing without any reason like that. And we want to give education about modern logic and especially in non-classical logic like that.
Okay, that's good. That's great. Yeah. So what are we going to do here is first I will ask Graham a few questions, maybe basics about logic and things like paraconsistent logic or dialetheism, and then after I ask questions, I will give you Aqil several questions to ask him. So it will be in continuous session. So yeah, okay. Let's start from the first question, the most basic question. Graham, what is logic?
Well, the word logic gets used by different people in the history of philosophy in different ways. Okay. I don't think there's any right or wrong about this. I mean, it can just bear many meanings, but it's understood in a very particular way by contemporary formal logicians. And it means this. People give reasons. So we say A because B or things like that. Logicians call these inferences. Okay. And some inferences are pretty good inferences. You know, the conclusion really does follow from the premises, and some that they're not very good. So if I say there are at least 10 people in the room, so there are at least 3 people in the room, that's okay. That follows, right? But if I say there are at least 10 people in the room, so some of them are wearing red hats, you say, well, what's the connection, right? So an inference where the conclusion really follows from the reasons is called valid. And so one where the conclusion doesn't follow from the reasons, the premises, is called invalid. And logic, as most contemporary logicians understand it, is something like the study of validity. What reasons are good, what reasons are bad, and why. Okay, now, like most things in philosophy, that's a contentious claim, but that's certainly, I think, a very standard understanding of what logic is amongst contemporary logicians.
Is logic natural?
What do you mean?
Does it a property that is within our universe, or is it outside of it?
Well, we're very firmly in this universe, and it's something that we give reasons, so it's very firmly in this universe.
So it's in no way supernatural?
What do you mean?
It's something that is outside of this universe. I know this sounded this is sounded silly if I say this, but some people say that logic is something that is not natural. Therefore, it's some way prove the existence of the giver or of logic, or maybe God in some sense. What would you respond to that?
I don't think many modern logicians would give this view any credence. And as a matter of fact, most philosophers and logicians in the history of philosophy, East and West, wouldn't have given this view much credence either.
I see. Is it okay if I ask, why is that?
Well, I think to answer that question, you'd have to tell me more about what people mean when they say this. Because natural and supernatural are very vague terms. Okay. So if someone tells me that logic is supernatural, before I really engage, I need to know what they mean.
I see. Yeah, I really don't have a concrete definition of what's supernatural either. I consider myself a naturalist. I adhere to naturalism framework, so I don't consider that as well. But yeah, I think your answer quite represent what I really want to know. So the next question, following up from that, do we invent or discover logic?
That's a good question. I don't know that there's any consensus to the answer to that question, because there are different views on the nature of what makes an inference valid. So some people think that inferences are valid in virtue of the meanings of the words involved. Okay, that's a very common view. So immediately we're engaged in the question of what meanings are. Okay. And there are different views on that. Meanings obviously concern language. So there's a question of the nature of language and its relationship to the things that language talks about. And there are different answers to that. Some people think that language is kind of important in constructing the reality in which we live. So if you hold that kind of view, you might think of language and therefore meaning and therefore inference as created. On the other hand, you might think that meanings function the way they do because they describe what's out there in reality, in which case language and meanings and logic are discovered. So, I mean, the answer to your question involves very deep metaphysical questions concerning the relationship between language or thought and what's out there. And the answers to that kind of question are always going to be contentious.
Okay, so if you're given a time 2 to 3 minutes, what would your answer be?
Well, okay, I've made several claims or several things there. So, I mean, when you say what would the answer to that be, it might depend on the exact question you're asking. But language is certainly a human creation, but it works pretty efficiently precisely because it does connect us with the world very well a lot of the time. So I don't really see this as an either-or matter. I think there are elements which we create and elements which we find, and I think they both play some kind of essential role. So you might say that I'm kind of weaseling out of the question because I think that both things are involved. But like so many things in philosophy, matters are complex and there's no sort of very simplistic answer.
Okay. Yeah, I still want to ask you more, but let's leave it at that. Let's continue for the next question. What does logic tells us about our world? And what does logic doesn't tell us?
Yeah, you're asking really tough questions, okay? And
Is it?
oh yes. No, look, you're asking questions which have been hammered over by philosophers for 2,500 years. They're not going to have simple answers.
Well, just give the hard answer. I'm glad to hear that. I'm excited.
Yeah. Well, look, logic is about inference, giving reasons. Reasons have premises and conclusions. And the standard view is that the premises are someone else's business. So if I'm reasoning about biology, my premises are going to concern biology, and that's not the affair of the logician. Okay. When the biologist draws inferences, then that is the affair of the logician. So, in that sense, if you want to know about the world, you're going to have to talk to the biologist and the historian, maybe the theologian, maybe the linguist. Okay. Logic is not going to tell you about those things. That's someone else's business. But to the extent that all these people reason, and they do, then given what they endorse about linguistics or biology or whatever, then if we reason well, we can discover new things about the world. So reasoning can tell us things about the world. Does that answer your question, or have I missed things?
Um, to me, the answer is quite sufficient. I really like the answer, and given that we are quite constrained in time, and I believe that most of my audience and also Intuitionistik ID audience will find the question sufficient, whether they are terpuaskan apa Aqil? Whether they're satisfied. I'm so sorry. Whether they're satisfied, I think it's wholly another matter. But yeah, I
Well, look, I
really
mean, this is philosophy, and one thing about philosophy is that philosophers disagree with each other. You expect philosophers to disagree with each other, so I would expect some people to disagree with what I say, and that's fine, because that's what doing philosophy is all about. We have a disagreement, we discuss it. Sometimes we can come to a consensus, sometimes we can't. That's life.
Right. Leading on from disagreement, we are going to talk about the paraconsistent logic. This will be my last question before I pass it on to Aqil. So Aqil, after this question, you should prepare yourself. At this part, after this part, you can get a little bit too technical, Graham, because this is the kind of questions that Aqil's audience will be so exhilarated to listen to. Okay, so yeah, my question is, what is paraconsistent logic?
All right. So we're going to get a little bit technical. Okay. So inferences have premises and conclusions. And there is one inference, or putatively valid inference, which nowadays goes by the name explosion. It has a medieval name in Western Latin philosophy called ex contradictione quodlibet sequitur. From a contradiction, anything follows. Okay. But nowadays it's usually called explosion, because it says that once you've got inconsistent premises, things explode. Everything follows, right? So here's an instance of it. Donald Trump is corrupt and Donald Trump is not corrupt. So the Earth has 17 moons, or one moon, or anything you like. Okay. That is explosion. It says a contradiction will imply everything. Now, that doesn't really sound very plausible, because there's no connection between the premise and the conclusion, right? But if you do a class at a university or a college on logic, you will study something called classical logic. I'll come back to that in a second. And according to classical logic, and incidentally intuitionist logic, that is a valid inference. Now, that might sound crazy, but there are sort of plausible reasons for this, which we can go into if you like. But a paraconsistent logic is one where explosion is not valid. And paraconsistent logic has an interesting history, because if you study a first course in logic, you'll be taught what's now called classical logic. So you might think that this is a very old system of inference, and it really isn't. I mean, it's a construction of the late 19th century, early 20th century. So, I mean, the earliest formal system of logic, or the earliest system of logic we know, is Aristotle's syllogistic. And explosion is not valid in syllogistic. And we know that because Aristotle himself tells us in the Analytics. So where does this principle of inference called explosion come from? Well, to the extent that we understand it, it at first appears in medieval Latin logic around the 12th century, where someone discovers an argument for it. There's a guy called William of Soissons who's working in Paris. And certainly logicians in the medieval Latin West are familiar with this inference. It's contentious. Some people think it's valid, some people think it isn't. And the medievals love to draw distinctions. So they'll say, well, there are many notions of validity. According to some, it's valid. According to some, it isn't. Okay, it's debated in the medieval Latin world. I don't think it's debated in the Arabic West, because most of them are straight Aristotelians, or at least their main major influence is Aristotle. So they endorse syllogistic, and syllogistic is paraconsistent. Okay, after the period of history in the West called the Renaissance, so it happens around the 16th century, everything that happens in the Latin West is forgotten. And if you read philosophers in, say, Europe after that, they don't know anything about logic except really what Aristotle had to say. So orthodox logic, after the rise of scientific revolution, is paraconsistent. But then you get this amazing revolution in formal logic at the end of the 19th century, where mathematicians actually deploy logic. They deploy mathematical techniques to logic for really the first time, and that's because the appropriate mathematical techniques weren't really developed until the 19th century. They're things like abstract algebra, combinatorics, model theory, and so on. These are all, really inventions of the 19th century in mathematics. So mathematicians like Gottlob Frege, the German, Bertrand Russell, the English mathematician, invent this new logic, which we now call classical logic. And they were interested in the foundations of mathematics, so they were interested in the inferences that mathematicians use. But the new machinery they developed was so superior to the old machinery that it soon became orthodox. So, and it still is pretty orthodox. So as I say, if you do a first course in logic now in a philosophy department, a mathematics department, a computer science department, that's probably what you'll be taught. But classical logic, so-called, has always had problems. And logicians have known this. And so almost as soon as classical logic had been invented or formulated, logicians started to construct other systems of logic. And they used exactly the same techniques as were used by Frege and Russell. Frege and Russell thought that they're applying that techniques, they would get a logic out of it, and they did. But we've come to realize that exactly the same techniques can be used to construct many, many different systems of logic, and these are called non-classical logics. One of the earliest is Intuitionist logic. So Aqil mentioned this earlier. So Intuitionist logic spins off a philosophy of mathematics. It was invented by a Dutch mathematician called Brouwer in the first decade of the 20th century. Now, Brouwer himself was against the use of formal logic. He didn't like formal logic. But within 15 years, another Dutch mathematician, logician, philosopher, Arend Heiting, had invented something called Intuitionistic Logic, which he took to represent the correct intuitionist reasoning. So Intuitionist logic is a non-classical logic. It's one of the earliest non-classical logics, but it's explosive. It validates explosion, like classical logic. But since the early part of the century, so many different logics, so many different non-classical logics have been invented, and some of those are paraconsistent. So the investigation of modern paraconsistent logic started really, well, the earliest paper is in the late 40s, but really the investigation took off in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and now there are many, many systems of paraconsistent logic. That is, logics where explosion is not regarded as a valid inference. And these are well understood now. So if you look at the American Mathematical Society, it has a catalogue of all the mathematical areas, including sub-areas of logic. And paraconsistent logic has its own subcategory. So it's mathematics is well known, well understood now, and we're still in finding out things about them, but they're pretty well understood. And so a lot of work in paraconsistent logic now goes into applying them. So investigating the applications of these logics. That's a healthy area of logical investigation nowadays. Are paraconsistent logics correct? Well, that's a contentious question. I think probably that they're correct is a minority view in logic, but certainly there are a lot of people who do endorse such logics. So that's the sort of the rough state of play with respect to paraconsistent logic nowadays.
Right. I'm starting to get a little bit excited because we are talking a lot of history as a history geek myself, and I think Aqil already get excited as well because we are already talking about logics in the sense it's not the classical one. Right. So from this moment on, I will give Aqil a chance to ask questions. It will be around 20 to 35 minutes. So yeah, the next questions will be a lot more technical than I have right now. I give the mic to you, Aqil. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Fuad. So, yeah, I don't know. I've met you like yesterday, Graham. So maybe I'll give you another question that maybe a little bit technical, I guess. So my question is about about logic, of course. So my first question is, so is like proof and model theory, I guess it will be correspond each other. Like uh I I learned about substructural logic before after I read your book about non-classical logic. It focused on model theory, if I'm not wrong, because you give us the tableau technique like that. And when I learned about substructural logic, it's gonna be like different because that was a proof theory, and it
Mm.
it should be correspond each other, like if you have logic on substructural logic, you can translate it in model theory or like model theory to substructural logic. It possible, right, or not? If yes, what is the philosophical implication?
Yeah, look, okay. So there's a standard distinction in logic between systems of proof and systems of models, okay? In systems of proof, you've got various syntactic rules of proof, and then you define a valid inference as one that can be obtained by putting those rules together, essentially. In model theory, you consider structures which you can think of crudely as meanings of words. So a model is an interpretation of the language, and then you define validity in terms of what you use models to define a notion of what it is to be true in interpretation, and then you define validity as an inference is valid if it's truth preserving in the interpretation. Okay, so these are two very general strategies for defining validity. There are others, but those are two major ones. So every logic will have usually a proof theory and a model theory. This is true of classical logic, intuitionist logic, paraconsistent logics, and you hope that those two definitions line up.
Yeah.
They give the same result. So if an inference is proof theoretically valid, it's model theoretically valid, and vice versa. This is called soundness to completeness. And usually you do. They don't always. There are logics which have a model theoretic definition of validity for which there's no corresponding proof theory. Second order logic is a classical second order logic as an example. But usually the aim is to get these two notions of validity to tie up. Okay. And that's true across all logics, classical and non-classical. Now, to complicate matters, there are various different methods, regimes of proof. Okay. So the oldest one in modern logic is axiomatics. You just give a bunch of axioms, right? But there are two more modern ones, natural deduction and sequent calculi. And both of those are due to the German, or was he Austrian? I think he was
Gensen?
German mathematician Gerhard Gensen in the 1930s, 1940s. And if you've ever tried to prove things in axiom systems, you'll know how bloody hard
No.
it is. And natural deduction and sequent calculi are much easier to get aware of, just because they correspond much more naturally to the way that people actually reason. That's why natural deduction is called natural deduction. So there are three notions of proof theory. Then there's a fourth one you mentioned, which is tableau. And I did use that in when I wrote the introduction to non-classical logic, because it's pedagogically easy. It's simple. I mean, it's algorithmic. You don't have to guess. You just apply a bunch of rules. So it's pedagogically useful. And, in that book, I was trying to convey to people who read it a whole host, many, many different systems of logic. So I wanted a proof theory that was easy. And that's why I used Tableau. But I actually think that the best form of regimenting reasoning is natural deduction or sequent calculi. They're very closely related. And virtually every system of logic that I know will have axiom systems. It will have a natural deduction system or systems. It will have sequent calculi systems. It will have tableau systems. So logicians are familiar with all these notions of proof and use them all, right? Some are more natural in some contexts than others. That's true. Now, you mentioned substructural logics. Substructural logics are a kind of logic. They're usually based on sequent calculi. Okay, so they use the Gensen method of sequent calculi, and nearly all logics have sequent calculi formalizations. All right. Many of these sequent calculi are not substructural, because substructural logics are a very specific kind of sequent calculi. They are those where things called structural rules that you use in classical logic are rejected. So there are sort of standardly three structural rules. One is called weakening, where you can have premises and conclusions. One is called contraction, where you can combine more than one occurrence of the same premise or conclusion. And one is called cut, where you can, which is really just transitivity of deducibility. All right, now in substructural logics, you drop one or maybe some or maybe all of those. Okay, that's what makes them substructural, because the structural rules are dropped. Okay, and classical logic, you can have a sequent calculus for it, but it's not substructural. Intuitionist logic is also formulated as a sequent calculus, and it is not substructural because it has all the structural rules. Okay, so sorry, that was probably a much more complicated answer to your question than you wanted, but that's it.
Okay. So yeah, because I feel different to like make a solution about like two theorem or assertion about logic, about proposition of logic with two methods. Because from structural proof, you need to look at the proof, look at the rule, like what you can do with that, and you just apply it to the proposition you want to prove. But my question next is about proof theory, and the history of logical philosophy, I guess, philosophy of logic, I guess, because I think there is a Russian logician that have big contribution to structural logic. I guess Orlov and Kolmogorov should have big, in non-classical logic. Also, big, yeah, written by Orlov like that. Because I don't know, maybe you can tell about Orlov contribution or Kolmogorov contribution on proof theory, because maybe that have a big contribution too in relevant logic or something like that.
Yeah. Look, those are very different mathematicians. Orlov published the first paper in the 1920s on, which was really the first paper in an area of logic called relevant logic. Now, he was writing a long time before sequent calculi were invented, so he didn't contribute to that area at all. So, you know, sequent calculi were invented only in the 1930s, 40s, and Orlov is writing in the 20s. Okay, so he made no contribution to sequent calculi. Kolmogorov is a bit different. I mean, he was a mathematician who made contributions to many areas of mathematics, including probability theory, and I'm not exactly sure of his dates, but I think he's writing before the invention of sequent calculi too. But he did certainly made contributions to the philosophy of intuitionistic logic, where he theorized what a proof is. Okay, and he did this in terms of mental constructions, which it's an idea you find in Brouwer, but this account of what a proof is due to a number of different mathematicians, including Brouwer and Kolmogorov, and it's giving an account of what a proof is in terms of mental constructions. Again, I mean, this has nothing to do with sequent calculi. It's an explanation of the nature of proof.
Okay.
Of course, it's compatible with sequent calculi, but he didn't work in sequent calculi, at least as far as I know.
So I don't know. Maybe, like, you know, Russian logician had Russia have a lot of logician, but I don't know. Maybe Soviet back then not support them, because like there is a bit conflict about logic is static things, and they want a dialectic things. If I'm not wrong, the history of Russia logic is like that. And maybe next question is about uh it have it has connection with nonism, of because I I think this have connection to in my know, because the next question is about simplicity. The argument that against Meinong came from Quine, if I was not if I was not wrong, and he said that the Meinong theory is not simple. It assumes a lot of metaphysical things, and with his regimentation, he he did the method like Russell, and said that this we should assume that being and existence is one thing. And I don't know, what's your opinion or your view about the simplicity argument? Is it a good argument or not? And maybe you should answer about nonism of also.
Okay. So nonism is the view that some things don't exist. For example, okay, everyone's favorite is fictional objects. So I don't know what fictions you guys in Indonesia read. I'm not particularly familiar with the culture. But a standard example in the West is a fictional object like Sherlock Holmes. So he's a fictional detective who was invented by an English writer called Arthur Conan Doyle. And he wrote stories about Sherlock Holmes. But Sherlock Holmes is a fictional object. There's never been a Sherlock Holmes, right? It's a total fictional object. And Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist. It's a creation of Conan Doyle's imagination. Since you're an intuitionist, you might like this idea because, after all, if you're an intuitionist, then numbers are mental constructions as well. So anyway, okay. So look, nonism is absolutely orthodox in the history of Western philosophy. All the great medieval logicians thought that some objects don't exist. That's both in the Arabic and the Latin traditions. So the idea that some means some existent is a relatively modern view. Okay. Now, one person who endorsed it was Meinong. So Meinong is an Austrian logician and psychologist and philosopher, and he's writing around the turn of the 20th century, about the same time that modern logic is coming into existence. He's attacked by Russell, and Russell attacks him on the grounds that it's not the simplicity argument. Russell attacks him on the grounds that Meinong's view leads to contradictions. Okay, so if you consider, for example, let's think of an imaginary contradictory object, the round square, standard example. Russell says, look, hey Meinong, according to you, the round square is round and square, so it's round and not round. That's a contradiction. You can't have contradictions. Okay, that's essentially Russell's argument. Okay, whether this is a fair critique is a different matter. Certainly Meinong had replies to it, but that was Russell's argument, main argument. We can go into that if you like. But Russell had a big impact on Quine. So Quine's right. Russell is writing in the first 10 years of the 20th century, but Russell's views get picked up by contemporary logicians, and they get picked up by Quine, who writes a very famous article called On What There Is. I think that's 1940s, where he takes up Russell's views and argues that some means some existent, and he attacks Meinong. And if you read it, it's a very rhetorical paper. I mean, it uses a lot of sort of rhetorical devices. I mean, he sort of slanders Meinong by saying Meinong has a slum of what does he call them? A slum of unruly elements. Okay, so he doesn't actually use the simplicity argument. He just asks lots of rhetorical questions and says we'd be better off without non-existent objects. Okay, now there is a sort of simplicity argument at the back of Quine. Now, simplicity is said in many ways. Okay, one version of simplicity is sometimes called Occam's razor, after the Latin medieval philosopher logician William of Ockham, and who actually never said it. But, you know, like many things in the history of logic and philosophy, they get attributed to people who didn't invent them. All right. So sometimes Occam's razor is expressed by the thought that entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity. And so a theory which has fewer objects, in one sense, is simpler. Not fewer objects, fewer kinds of objects. So you might say that if you're a nonist, someone who thinks that some things don't exist, you got two kinds of objects, existent and non-existent. Yeah, that's right in some sense. And so a theory which has only existent objects is simpler in that sense. Okay. Now, but Occam's razor says that entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity. I mean, modern science is full of bizarre objects which get postulated to explain things we can't otherwise explain, such as subatomic particles with bizarre properties. And I don't think I need to sort of belabor that point if you know something about modern physics. Okay, so the question is, do you need to postulate non-existent objects? And there are very good reasons why you do. They give you an account of, for example, fiction. They give you an account of the fact that we talk about objects that exist and don't exist all the time. We might even know whether the objects we talk about exist or not, but we think about them. Now, if you don't believe in non-existent objects, you've got to tell some kind of story about what's going on here. Quine has a story to tell, and it's very complex. I mean, partly he just writes off the whole area as meaningless, which is crazy. But sometimes he'll tell slightly different stories. So you buy simplicity in one sense, Occam's razor, at buying complexity in a different way. Namely, you've got to tell very complicated stories about fiction or intentionality. So the simplicity argument is multifaceted. And I think Quine's view is perhaps still the orthodox, certainly in this country, but I think it's also waning now. And people are going back to the more traditional view, quite rightly, I think, that some things don't exist. That's my reading of the current situation anyway.
Hello. I think Russell will dislike your work about Sylvan box because it contains contradictory objects like empty box and non-empty box. If I'm right, and it, I don't know. Maybe your view about it's okay, but there's a contradictory object in the story if it's still coherent. And maybe I'm gonna uh okay, give comment about simplicity because Lewis gave argument about simplicity about the my method is simple, though my possible world is not simple in model realism is not simple in entity quantity like that, but maybe you could tell us like the different of the tradition different of philosophical tradition in USA like American and UK and maybe Australia because maybe Australia give you a lot of philosophical thought that more tolerate to metaphysics, and it gives a broad things in logic too. Maybe you can tell us about that.
Sure. Okay. So just a comment about Sylvan's box. I mean, you're right about Sylvan's box. It's a story about Nick and Graham find a contradictory object lodged amongst Richard Sylvan, who's an old friend of mine, his possessions. So in the story, Nick and Graham find a contradictory object. There's a box that's both empty and has got something in it. Now, this is a fiction object. And in the story, the object is contradictory, but there's no such thing in reality. Okay, I'm not telling you a story about a contradictory object. I'm telling you a story about an object that has contradictory objects in the fiction. So coming back to Sherlock Holmes, I mean, there's never, according to Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes lives in Baker Street, which is a street in central London. So it's true in the story that a detective lives in Baker Street. But Baker Street has never had a detective living in it, okay? So what's true in the story is not true in reality. And the fact that there's a contradictory object in Sylvan's box, the story, doesn't mean there's a contradictory object in reality. It's a fictional object. So the story doesn't tell you that there are contradictions in reality, just contradictions in a fiction. Okay, so this takes us to truth in fiction. What is truth in fiction? What does it take to be true in fiction? Okay, that's an interesting debate in contemporary philosophical logic. And David Lewis is an important character in this. So, possible worlds started to be used in contemporary logic, largely as a result of the work by Saul Kripke in the 1950s, 1960s. And since then, possible worlds have had an enormous impact on modern logic. They're deployed all over the place to give accounts of many different logics. And there is a discussion of how you should understand the notion of a possible world. I'm not sure there's any orthodoxy about this. You can take them to be concrete objects, as did David Lewis. You can take them to be abstract objects. For example, Stolnack has that view. You can take them to be kind of thought experiments or sort of posited objects, a bit like Kripke himself did. You can take them to be non-existent objects, which is my preferred view. But there are several different stories, and that's been an ongoing debate. I think David's view is probably in a minority. This is modal realism, but we can come back to that if you want. Let's just leave it at the fact that there are many discussions about the ontology, the nature of possible worlds. Okay, let's come back to fiction. Because what is it to be true in a fiction? Well, David Lewis had a very influential answer to that question. And what he said is that if you take a fiction, what it says is not realized in the actual world. That's what makes it a fiction rather than a history, right? But truth in a fiction, to be true in a fiction is to be true in all those worlds which realize the fiction. So take the Conan Doyle stories about Sherlock Holmes. Many things that Conan Doyle says about Sherlock Holmes are not true. They're just true in the fiction. But of course, Conan Doyle's telling us stories. He's sort of depicting a world. It may be a non-existent world, or not an actually existent world, but he's describing a kind of world. And to be true in the fiction is to be realized in all those worlds that realize what Conan Doyle says in the fiction. Okay. David Lewis did not like impossible worlds. He only liked possible worlds. All right, but that was his account of truth in fiction. Now, David was well aware that some fictions contain contradictions. So I think of one of David's own examples is Sherlock Holmes stories. So Sherlock Holmes has a friend called Dr. Watson. Dr. Watson had been in the army, and Dr. Watson was wounded in his military campaigns. And in some of the stories, the war wound is in the arm and some is in the leg. So the Conan Doyle stories contain contradictions. Okay, so obviously that's a problem if you're David Lewis' account of fictional objects, because obviously the contradiction can't hold in a possible world. At least this was David's view. So what do you say about this? What David said was this: when you get a contradiction in a fiction, like the one I've just described, what you do is you kind of split it into two sub-theories. So, I mean, there are kind of sub-theories of the Doyle stories where the wound is in the arm, and there are sub-theories where the wound is in the leg. So you kind of split the stories apart and consider two kind of consistent sub-theories, sub-stories, if you like. That was David's solution. Now, you mentioned my story, Sylvan's Box. That actually resulted from a discussion I was having with David many years ago, where we were talking about fictions, and we were talking about worlds, and we were talking about his strategy for dealing with inconsistent fictions. And he said, look, when you get an inconsistent fiction, you just break it into two consistent sub-stories, right? And I said, yeah, I don't believe you can do it always. I mean, that seems maybe the right thing to do with Conan Doyle, because after all, probably the inconsistency was unintentional. Conan Doyle just forgot what he wrote several years before. That's okay. But I reckon you can write a story where the inconsistency is integral to the story. And if you break it into consistent sub-stories, you really do not understand it. And David said, I don't believe you. So I said, okay, I'll write your story. So I wrote the story in response to that. So if you've read Sylvan's Box, you'll know that Nick and Graham find this inconsistent object. And the fact that it's inconsistent plays an integral role to the plot. If you try and split it into two consistent sub-stories, the story just does not work. Okay. Now, you said, is the story coherent? I'll leave that for you to judge. You read it, you be the judge.
Yeah.
Okay. I reckon it's very coherent, even if it's inconsistent. So that's why I wrote that story. It was to write a fiction, which is where the inconsistency is integral to the plot. All right. So actually, I'm very sympathetic towards Lewis' stories about fiction. I think to be true in a fiction really is to be true in a world. But I think that what that means is that you need impossible worlds. You need to go beyond possible worlds to impossible worlds. Now, impossible worlds are now very standard creatures of modern logical technology. Their mathematics is well understood. We can talk about that if you like, but let's pass that over for a moment. Of course, impossible worlds raise many new philosophical issues, such as do they have the same status as possible worlds? Or do they have different status, or what is their nature? Okay, we can go into that if you want. But I do think that Lewis' account of truth in fiction is essentially right, but I do think it needs impossible worlds. Okay, so David, of course, read Sylvan's Box, and David was he's a great philosopher, of course, but he was a very honest person. And he wrote to me and said, look, I think you're right. You've shown me that fictions can be inconsistent, and the inconsistencies can be integral to the plot. So he realized he had to revise his theory of fictional objects. I don't think he ever did. As far as I know, he remained against impossible worlds to the day he died. So I don't know that he ever revised his theory to take account of Sylvan's Box, but he did admit that his account was inadequate as it stood. So that's a bit of sort of history of Meinongianism and worlds and impossible objects. So again, that's probably a longer answer than you wanted, but that's the answer you got. Okay.
And so, like, it's gonna be personal question. Like, maybe you can mention the different about the tradition of philosophy from US, UK, and Australia. And I think you have a big influence from Australia. Give you a big influence on your philosophical thought, because I don't know, you got a lot of friends, and maybe Lewis got a big influence on Australia too. Like maybe Rotley give you a big thought on that, and yeah.
Right. Okay, so look, first of all, David Lewis came to Australia regularly. He and his wife Steffi came to Australia every northern summer for 20 odd years. And he went to the conferences, he went to departments, he gave talks. He was very well known in Australia, very well liked too. Everybody admired David. And lots of Australian philosophers were influenced by David. So if you look at David Armstrong, Frank Jackson, important Australian philosophers, they were highly influenced by David. But David was really Aquinean. I mean, he did his doctorate in Harvard, and he was influenced by Quine. So Quine was never sympathetic to modal logic, and David did make a big break from him in that way. But really, he broke from Quine on Quinean grounds, because he thought that his story about possible worlds was the simplest way of explaining modality. But in all other ways, he was very much Aquinean, and so he was a classical logician very much, as were Armstrong and Jackson and so on. And so, that a lot of Australian philosophers are classical logicians, or at least they weren't logicians, but they were sympathetic towards classical logic. So neither Armstrong nor Jackson were logicians, although they knew that some logic. Now, Australian logicians were quite different creatures because Australian logicians, for historical reasons, were always very sympathetic towards non-classical logic. And that's partly because Australia skipped over a generation of logic. So if you went to Australia in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, the only logic you would have found taught was Aristotelian logic. By this time, of course, modern mathematical logic was being taught in Europe and in America and in Britain. That was never the case in Australia. So when the first important logicians arose in Australia, and we're talking about the 1960s here, they were more interested in non-classical logics than in classical logic. And so we're talking about logicians like Len Goddard, Richard Routley, or who changed his name later to Richard Sylvan, Bob Meyer, and those guys trained a generation of logicians in Australia, and their interests were in non-classical logic. So the big schools of logic in Australia, in Armidale, in Canberra, in Melbourne, have always been centered on non-classical logic, and most of, not all, but most of the work on formal logic, mathematical logic, has been done on non-classical logic. There was never the orthodoxy about classical logic in Australia amongst logicians that there was in Europe and in America. So a lot of the work that on formal logic, mathematical logic that comes out of Australia is on non-classical logic, and that accounts for much of my work, because when I moved to Australia in the mid-70s, I fell in with the Australian logicians like Routley and Meyer and Goddard very fast, and so I worked with them for many years on non-classical logic. Now times are changing. Non-classical logic is much more acceptable all over the world than it was in the 1970s. Classical logic is still, I think, probably orthodox in the sense that it's the first kind of logic you'll learn in a course in logic in Australia or in Europe or in the West. I mean, what happens in Indonesia, I have no idea. You can tell me. So the kind of orthodoxy is breaking down, I think. But you point to a difference between what's come out of Australia in logic and what, at least until recently, has come out of Europe and the Anglosphere in the north in formal logic. And that really is a major difference. I mean, Australia and New Zealand have been much more sympathetic to non-classical logics than the rest of the West has been, at least until recently.
Okay, that's new for me. I didn't know that Lewis was a classicist logician, but yeah.
Oh, he was very much so. Well, he was a modal
Okay.
logician. Okay, sometimes modal logic is called a non-classical logic. Sometimes it isn't. That's a sort of a grey area. He was certainly a modal logician, but he was a modal logician whose modal logic was based on classical first order logic. Okay, so in that sense, he was a classical logician. Sure.
He gave account, and Stolnaker gave account about conditional logic, if I'm not wrong. That's that.
Yes. So again, I mean, David and Bob Stolnaker formulated what now you should call conditional logics, but there's a sense in which those are classical too. Let me explain. There's a distinction in non-classical logics between those logics which think that classical logic is all right as far as it goes, but classical logic doesn't have the vocabulary to express important notions. So it's okay as far as it goes, but it's just expressively incomplete. Standard modal logics are like that. They're based on classical first-order logic, but you need modal operators to be able to express modality. Okay. Now, there's a much more challenging notion of a non-classical logic, which says that what's wrong with classical logic is not merely its expressive incompleteness, but the fact that a lot of things about classical first-order logic are wrong. And that includes intuitionist logic. So those are the more sort of strongly anti-classical logics, as it were. Okay, now, modal logic, at least modal logic based on classical first-order logic, is non-classical in the first sense, but not the second. Conditional logics are exactly the same. So what they do is they expand the machinery of classical first-order logic with a new kind of conditional operator, often thought of as a kind of counterfactual conditional. So again, they're a bit like modal logic, that they take classical first-order logic and then they extend it with a new operator, a conditional, a new kind of conditional. You've still got the old kind of conditional, but you've got this extra expressive power. So David certainly believed in non-classical logics in that sense, in the same way that he believed in modal logics. In fact, there's a very close relationship between modal logics and conditional logics, which you probably know. So David endorsed non-classical logic as he thought that you needed a non-classical logic which added to classical logic in its expressive power, but he never thought that classical logic was wrong. And the same goes for Stormacher.
So I want to give you about the philosophy in Indonesia, right? So logic in my faculty, in my university, just give one course, like that was a 3 credits semester, 3 credit in one semester. So it's just logic. There's no philosophy of logic. There's no non-classical logic, and there's no things about more than propositional logic. So there's no like first order logic. So yeah, when me and my friend you met him yesterday, Ahnaf, we learned it by ourselves, like from your book, and yeah, just give the interpretation about the book, like how your comment about this book, and yeah, just go like that. And yeah, maybe I don't know if me and my friend can translate your work or like your not classical logic book. Maybe in someday that's gonna be help our philosophy, philosophy world, Indonesian philosophical worlds, and yeah, let's do that. And about Indonesian philosophy, that was contentious because a lot of Indonesian philosopher or academician said that there is no Indonesian philosophy. Though, if you know about Sriwijaya, like Sriwijaya Kingdom, that was a big. There was a big, university there. Someone from China, if they want to go to Nalanda University, that's a big university from on India. They need to go to Sriwijaya, and that was second big. If it's not wrong, if it's not wrong historically, a big school and big university, but there's no like paper or something that we can found from Sriwijaya. So yeah, we I don't know. It must be there. Like I have I have you know I have like big belief that there is a logic from this country or like philosophical ideas from this country, but we we didn't find it yet. So yeah, and that's my on my like last question is still Intuitionistic logic, it grounded on intuitionism, and intuitionism is grounded on intuition. Is intuitionistic logic still intuitive? Like, explosion principle, it's that logic is type explosion principle, but explosion principle is not intuitive, right? No, it's
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Look, okay. So first of all, I'm interested to hear what you say about philosophy and logic in Indonesia. I mean, I've never been to Indonesia, so I don't really know what's happening there. I mean, I do know that Indonesia has a very interesting history, and there were lots of influences on Indonesia that came from India, maybe less so China. There have certainly been some Christian influences, but of course, it's predominantly an Islamic country. So my guess is that most people who know a lot about philosophy in Indonesia would know Islamic philosophy, or at least Arabic philosophy, which is a very important part of philosophy. And I'm not surprised that modern Western logic hasn't percolated far into Indonesia, just because there isn't that kind of culture, because, so modern logic is very much a product of 19th, 20th century mathematics, and that had an enormous impact on the West. I think less so on the Asian countries, although that's changing fast now. And if you and your friends want to translate the book at some stage, you'd be very welcome. I mean, it has been translated into a few languages, bits of it translated into German, some of it's been translated, I think all of it's been translated into Spanish. If you guys want to translate into Indonesian, that'd be fabulous. Cambridge holds the copyright, but I'm sure they'd be delighted to negotiate an Indonesian copy. All right, so that's one thing. The second thing is about intuitionism. The situation there is complex. Let me try and keep this as simple as possible. Intuitionism spins off a philosophy of mathematics developed by Brouwer in the first 20 years of the 20th century. And according to this, mathematical objects are mental constructions. So they don't correspond to anything out there in the real world. They're constructions, and constructions, as we talked about earlier, are sort of proofs, or at least proofs are constructions. So what happens is that truth becomes identified with provability. So this is a standard move in intuitionism, right? Some people say it has no notion of truth. It's actually a bit more accurate to say it identifies truth with provability. It's a bit like positivism in that regard, logical positivism, except it's concerned with mathematics. Okay, and as we also talked about, intuitionist logic as such was invented by Heiting in the 1920s. Intuitionistic logic contains explosion, but soon after that, there was a variant of intuitionistic logic invented, and it's called minimal logic. And what minimal logic is essentially intuitionistic logic minus explosion. Okay. So there is this variation of intuitionist logic which is known, and that doesn't contain explosion. Okay. Now, as far as the philosophy of intuitionism goes, it never really has been taken up. The major person who took it up was a philosopher in the UK called Michael Dummett. And intuitionists in the Brouwer tradition thought that intuitionistic reasoning was correct for mathematics, but they didn't think it was right for other domains. Whereas Dummett argued that intuitionistic logic is correct for reasoning about everything. So Dummett was writing in the 1970s, 1980s, and Dummett had an enormous impact on the UK. he didn't have much impact on the United States. He's hardly known in the United States, but he dominated British philosophy for 30 years. But you don't find many philosophers who will endorse intuitionism as a philosophical view now. There are some. So intuitionistic type theory, which is a version of intuitionism invented, I think, by the Swedish logician Per Martin Löf, is currently undergoing a lot of popularity amongst computer scientists in particular. And they think that in some sense, that's the correct logic for reasoning about what goes on in computer science, maybe more generally. So there are still some people who like intuitionistic logic as the right logic, but that's very much a minority. Now, something else has happened, which is this. Never mind about the truth of intuitionist philosophy, okay? That's its own thing. What we have discovered is that there are really interesting mathematical structures, pure mathematical structures, whose internal logic is intuitionist. They don't work with classical logic. So probably the most interesting of these is sometimes called a theory of smooth infinitesimals, which is a theory of infinitesimals which uses essentially intuitionist logic. That's not the only example. You also find this kind of thing going on in topos theory, which is a version of part of category theory. But we now know that there are lots of cool pure mathematical structures which you need to understand that structure. You need to reason intuitionistically. So lots of contemporary mathematicians are interested in those structures, not because they're intuitionistic logic, not because they're intuitionist philosophers, but because they just recognize cool mathematical structures when they see them. And in fact, what we now know is that there are many logics which can be used as the internal logics of pure mathematical structures. Classical logic, intuitionist logic, paraconsistent logics. And so I think now we're becoming into an era in mathematics where, as far as pure mathematics goes, you've got to take the fact that mathematics is a plural noun seriously. Mathematics. There are classical mathematics, intuitionist mathematics, paraconsistent mathematics, and as far as pure mathematics goes, they're all equally good. When it comes to applying mathematics, it's a different story. But as far as pure mathematics goes, there are many different kinds. And so lots of pure mathematicians nowadays will investigate pure mathematical structures based on intuitionistic logic. So intuitionist mathematics has kind of acquired a life of its own, independently of the intuitionist philosophy of mathematics. So in a nutshell, that's sort of what's happened to intuitionism in the early 21st centuries.
Okay. Yeah. I
It's
know.
complicated.
So yeah, you said that Intuitionism as a philosophy and Intuitionistic mathematics, it goes in another way because yeah, in Intuitionistic they focus on the structure of the mathematics itself. And you mentioned about like Fan theorem, I guess, if you read in your what you have written in your book about mathematical pluralism and the example of the theorem or infinitesimal things like that only work on Intuitionism, Intuitionistic mathematics, not in classical mathematics. That's really for me. That's like, oh, so enlightened me. So, and maybe about the minimal logic. So yeah, Intuitionistic had a lot of variant. Like maybe Kolmogorov himself had another another Intuitionistic logic. Like before hating and Glivenko for did the Intuitionistic logic, he did it first, and he thought that I forgot what he rejects, but they like Griffenko and Hayek accepted theorem, so like that. Maybe I I took a lot of time from Fuad, so maybe
Yeah, you
that's
took
your
a
screen. Sorry,
you almost took an
sorry.
hour of mine.
Like your
It's okay. It's perfectly
that's your
fine.
screens.
Okay. Yeah, I believe it's the you've that will be your last question, right, Akil? Um, so from this point on, I'll be I retake the stage for questioning Graham. I have two questions for you before I ended up the conversation. Just let you know, there is one more person that want to ask you questions after my last questions. He's here in the room with Akil right now, but I'll reserve his chance for the last questions. So yeah, tell Ahnaf to prepare. My question is this: um, um, in your bio, which I read in Wikipedia, that you study Eastern philosophy. Is that correct? What made you
Yeah.
interested in Eastern philosophy?
Well, about 25 years ago, I'd been studying philosophy for about 25 years, and I knew nothing about the Asian traditions. And I've been trying to teach myself. But then I met somebody who knew some of the Asian traditions well, a guy called Jay Garfield, who's now an old friend. And talking to Jay, I came to understand that I was missing half the world's philosophy. So the Asian traditions are rich in philosophy, although they've been almost entirely ignored by the West. Why, you might argue about, is there an element of racism involved? Almost certainly. But talking to Jay, I realized that I was ignorant of half the world's philosophy. So just as I've been trying to teach myself Western philosophy, I decided I ought to teach myself some Eastern philosophy. So since then, I've been doing that, trying to teach myself Eastern philosophy by going to India, going to Japan, studying with people there, teaching courses on it, reading, of course, writing books. In Eastern philosophy, you find every interesting question you find in the West. What's the nature of reality? How do you know that? Should you live? How do you run society? You meet very familiar questions if you're coming from Western philosophy. Sometimes you meet answers that are familiar. Sometimes you meet answers that are unfamiliar. That's one of the cool things about it. So nowadays, when I do philosophy, I have both Eastern and Western traditions to draw on, and I feel that it makes my ability to address philosophical questions much richer than it would be if I knew only a bit of philosophy.
Can you tell us what is Eastern philosophy is all about for like 2 to 3 minutes?
Look, Eastern philosophy is about the same thing as Western philosophy. Namely, it's about philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And philosophical questions, the big questions, are the ones that I gave you.
Yeah.
What's the nature of reality? What is a person? How do you run the state? How should I live? How do you know these things? Those questions are present in every philosophical tradition I know. And philosophers try to provide answers to those questions, and not just provide answers, but give reasons for those answers. And you find these things in all philosophical traditions. So, in that sense, there's actually not much difference between the Eastern traditions and the Western traditions.
Okay, this will be my last questions, and I think this question is going to be important for us in Indonesia. That despite we are an Eastern country, we severely lacking in understanding of Eastern philosophy, just like Akil said. And I also a firm believer that our culture, way back in the past, have some kind of rich intellectual culture, just like he said. it was actually a pilgrimage. The Chinese and the Chinese people, if they want to go to India, they usually stop for 3 to 4 months in Sriwijaya, which is in Sumatra, my hometown. Yeah.
Okay.
It was a pilgrimage at the very, but I believe there was a big learning institutions there that sadly we get becoming unknown in our recent culture, because we didn't write things down, and even if we did, it's all lost. And so with that said, it's normal that our knowledge about philosophy mainly influenced by the West, because of colonialism. But then again, my question is, what are the West missing out about Eastern philosophy that if they learn about it right now, it would be beneficial for them?
All of it.
Okay.
What are they missing? They're missing half the world's philosophy, for God's sake. I mean, it's suppose you I don't know. Suppose you studied Western philosophy and you only studied part of it, medieval Latin philosophy, or German philosophy of the 18th century. Well, that's cool. That's good stuff. Are you missing out on philosophy? Sure you are, because you don't know a part of it. Okay. Well, if you study only Western philosophy, you don't know anything about the world's other traditions of philosophy. Are you missing out? Big time, because you only know part of it, right? So this is not rocket science. I mean, the world has many important philosophical traditions, and they all have points of insight. And if you want to understand philosophy, then it's good to understand all these things. And we're living in an age where philosophy is becoming global for the first time. So because communication is so much easier now than it was 100 years ago, it's possible for philosophical ideas, philosophical teachers to move between countries. And that's what's happening. So, this event that we're partaking in now would have been impossible 30 years ago. But it's a means of communication, which means that philosophical ideas are spreading. So it's much easier for the West to know about the East. It's much easier for the East to know about the West. And we're now seeing research in philosophy and logic done by teams that come from very different countries. So, this would have been impossible 40 years ago, but now it's quite common to have research in logic with, say, for logicians. One comes from Japan, one comes from Argentina, one comes from Germany, and they all work together because it's easy with, modern communication and air travel. So philosophy is becoming global for the first time. And where this is going to go, only a fool would predict. But I think we're actually in a very exciting time in philosophy, because when these cultures come into close contact, new ideas always develop. And we don't know what those are going to be. If we do, we know them already. We don't. So we wait and see what's coming. Now, I'm not going to be around that much longer. I won't see all these things. You guys are much younger. You will see amazing things in philosophy before the end of this century. That's a prediction.
I believe we will. And that will be my last question. The real last question will be delivered by one of our friends, Aqil. You can call the leader of Intuitionistik ID now. He was one of the speaker yesterday, which is
Hello,
if my
Graham.
release date is correct. There he
Graham.
is.
Since yesterday,
Hi.
I've been thinking about a lot of things, with your discussions, and but taking that aside, like when I heard about the three of you discussed, especially about the history of Indonesia, and basically we are lost. We have lost all the text, all the ancient texts about it, but basically we have a Buddhist learning center, in the ancient time, and that Learning Buddhist Center, one of the records says that the students learns about the Panchavidya, and one of it is Hedavidya, that is logic, and Intuitionistik ID is mm, also taking inspiration from that, in a sense that uh, Indonesia must also learn about logic, because we have at least the history of it. But when we try to find about the record, we don't have it. And then, but I believe, I don't know, maybe we believe that there's at least one logicians, but we can find one. But anyway, we are Intuitionistic ID trying to maybe rebuild it. I mean, we are trying to um, popularize about logic and philosophy, and trying to make people at least aware about logic and philosophy in general, because we are philosophy in Indonesia is not that popular. It's going to take off right now, but before it's not that popular. Even people somewhat anti-philosophy, because philosophy will make you atheist or something. But it's not the questions. But I want to ask, do you have any words uh, that inspires logicians, philosophers, or maybe public in Indonesia, um, uh, about the importance of logic and philosophy in general? And that is that's what I'm asked about from you, Graham.
Mm. Okay, so two things. First of all, philosophical questions are centrally important. Often they can get kind of very technical, very complex, and they can appear to be, the English word is arcane, not very important, but the big questions are questions that engage everybody, and everybody thinks about. How should I live? How should I relate to other people? What makes me a person? These are things that everybody engages with. Okay. Look, I once went to a talk by a British playwright called Tom Stoppard. I don't know if you ever heard him. He's a very important 20th century British playwright. He writes kind of philosophically oriented plays. And he said, someone asked him a question, and he said, look, let me tell you what the difference is between philosophers and plumbers. So a plumber is a tradesperson who goes in and repairs your pipes, right? And he said, look, the difference between philosophers and plumbers is this. When philosophers go down the pub, they discuss philosophy. True. But when plumbers go down the pub, they discuss philosophy because they talk about things that have meaning to their lives. How should they treat their spouses? Who should they vote for? How should they how would they want their society to be organized? What's okay? This sounds trite. What is the meaning of life? What the hell are we doing here? Is there an afterlife? These are all issues that involve that every person thinks about, and these are really important questions. Okay, now professional philosophers think about these questions and the things that spin off them in a very disciplined way. So they think about these things in a much more systematic way than people who are not philosophers. That's fine. But the questions themselves, I'm just saying, are important, and everybody thinks about them. Now, thinking about them systematically is important because they're hard questions. And if you don't think about them systematically, you can get very confused and come up with wrong answers. So that I don't think that's terribly contentious. Okay, so that's the philosophical bit. What about the logical bit? Well, look, I think I said this yesterday. logic gives you a set of tools for thinking about things. It sort of tells you what arguments are good and what arguments are not good. Not only that, it gives you a bunch of categories for framing your ideas. It tells you something about truth, whether it's the same as provability. Okay, that's something that logicians engage with. Now, so it gives you a bunch of important tools. Now, like most tools, they have some things they're useful for, some things they're not useful for. And certainly there's more than one tool in the philosopher's toolbox. Logic is one of them. There are lots of others. And you can do perfectly good philosophy without using the tools in the logician's toolbox. That's fine. But logic is an important tool in philosophizing. And if you deploy that tool, you can get great benefits from it in discussing some of these problems. So I know that formal logic is not everyone's taste. That's fine. But for those of us who find it a useful tool to use, and that includes me, I think it's an important tool in the philosopher's toolbox. And some people have kind of symbol phobia. They're never going to use formal logic because they just hate mathematics. Well, no, some people are like that. That's fine. But if you have the ability to understand these tools and use them, then like any other tool, it's a good tool to learn and use.
Thank you so much, Graham, for the answers. Yeah, maybe that's it. And I think for me personally, formal logic is a very powerful tool too, and that's what makes me love formal logic since the high school. And yeah, since high school, I just met the Aristotelian logic and maybe propositional logic, and I met non-classical logic because of your books, and that's why you are one of my heroes. Thank you, Graham. Yeah, let's go back to Fuad.
You're welcome.
Okay. Ahnaf kind of asked my kind of questions. I usually the one who engage with meaning-related questions, and yeah, he asked you that. Before I finish, I just want to say that earlier you said that you perhaps don't be around when the evolution of philosophy will become something much more exciting, or maybe something there is something exciting will be going, and you're not going to be around here, which is I think quite reasonable to say. But I just want to say this, that despite all of that, your legacy about logic, philosophy of logic especially, will remain, because there are this intuitionistic guy, and rest assured that I think they will do a great job with that.
Well, thank you for your kind words. We will see.
So philosophy like, yeah. Okay, that will be all. Aqil, thank you, and especially Graham Priest, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you guys. It's been a pleasure.